ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Bonjour à tous et tous. Each meeting, we take the time to recognize OC Transpo employees who demonstrate tremendous courage and compassion for residents of our city. This is an important tradition and one that I very much look forward to. À chaque réunion, nous prenons du temps de rendre hommage aux employés d'OC Transpo qui font preuve d'un formidable courage et de compassion envers les résidents de notre ville. Il s'agit d'une tradition importante et d'une occasion que j'attends avec impatience. Today you'll be hearing stories from the months of March and April of this year. Excuse me. On the morning of March 9th, just after bus operator Larry had dropped passengers off at his first stop on Route 87, he noticed a man collapsed on the ground near the former Sears building. After safely securing his bus, Larry immediately ran over to see if the man was okay and quickly noticed he was turning blue. Knowing how grave the situation was, Larry ran back to his bus and called the Transit Operations Control Center, who then contacted paramedics. After hanging up the phone, Larry ran back to the man and checked for a pulse, was not able to find one. As Larry was preparing to start CPR, a fire truck arrived on site, and the firefighter ran up to help. Soon after, paramedics arrived and took over the situation. Thanks to Larry's actions and ability to react in a stressful situation, he was able to help a man in desperate need. On April 26th, just after noon, operator Jatinder was completing Route 95 near the University of Ottawa when he noticed a customer having a seizure on his bus. He immediately secured his vehicle and calmly went over to help the customer. Once the operator was safe, operator Jatinder notified the Transit Operations Control Center of the incident. The control center quickly dispatched transit law and transit supervisors and notified paramedics. When the paramedics arrived on the scene, the customer was conscious and was transported to the hospital for further treatment. Thanks to operator Jatinder's attentiveness, quick action, and caring nature, he was able to help a passenger in need and ensure he received the medical attention that was required. Unfortunately, Jatinder is not able to join us today, but I'm very happy that Larry is here with his wife and his boss, who's going to make sure he gets a big promotion and the best routes in the city. And as chair of the Transit Commission, it's my honor to welcome you today to the meeting and to thank you for your outstanding actions. Your compassion and your quick action demonstrate that what the TransSecure program stands for, and also reinforces OC Transpo's continued commitment to the safety and security of our customers and to the entire Ottawa community. Votre compassion et vos actions rapides illustrent ce qui signifie le programme TransSecure et renforce l'engagement constant d'OC Transpo à l'égard de la sûreté et de la sécurité de ses clients et de la population d'Ottawa en général. It's my pleasure, Larry, to present you with your certificate, and thank you very much for your service to our city. So good morning again, and welcome to Agenda 30 of the Transit Commission. We have, do I see any declarations of interest? Seeing none, we have confirmation of the minutes, minutes 29 for the 16th of May 2018, and confidential minutes 29-16 May 2018. Carried. Thank you very much. We have two communications, responses to inquiries. Item number 1 is the status update Transit Commission motions and inquiries for the period ending 13 June 2018, that the Transit Commission received this report for information. It's received? Received. Thank you very much. Item number 2 is the capital adjustments and closing of projects for the Transit Commission. Okay, we'll hold that very quickly. And item number 3 is the renewal of the OC Transpo Special Constable Program My recommendation is that the Transit Commission receive this report for information.
Just a couple questions.
Couple of questions? Okay, so we will go back to item number 2. Councillor Cloutier, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of questions on some of the documents, clarifying. On document 1, in the second section, Transportation Services Department, the 8th item down, bus refurbishment and modifications 2011. My question is, what is the budgeted revenues? What was that 4.5 million? And there was, the actual revenues and recoveries was different. It was 7.4. What caused that difference?
I'll ask Finance just to comment on that, please.
Thank you. Pardon?
So the first question, it was the revenues relate to the tax revenues that would fund.
So there was a tax revenue. What do you mean a tax revenue?
But that was budgeted to fund those. A portion of the funding for the bus refurb would come from tax.
Was what?
So the portion of the funding for those bus refurbs would have come from tax.
Okay. But wasn't the tax reserves 2.9 million, as we see in the further column, as a source of funding, and it's going back to the tax reserves. I'm referring to the second column. Mm-hmm. There was a total authority of 19.5 million, and a net authority of 14.9 million. What would have been that revenue or recovery? I speculated it was warranty, but perhaps not.
Okay, typically that's government revenues. It may be that we had applied some PTIP funding to that. I'll have to go back and look, but I can follow up and let you know exactly where those revenues are coming from.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Treasurer. Yeah, just want to know, and that was in 2011. Just want to know what that source of revenue was. And my other question will be, what changed? What caused it to go from 4.5 to 7.4? Okay. On document 3, maybe this one will be easier. There's date changes. Were all these projects scheduled, and it's a council approval to remain open document, were all these projects scheduled to be finished in 2018?
There's varying dates with them all, and so in keeping with the policy, when we need to extend past that, we come back and we provide you the updated dates.
Okay. Some of these extensions are, as per the explanations, because of the change in the revenue service availability date. Will there be additional, and I see the authority and the unspent, do we anticipate that there will be a change to the costs, and how will that be funded?
No, we did a thorough review, and that's when we did the budget update to you last meeting, I believe. So if your question is there going to be a financial impact because of the adjustment to the revenue service availability date? No. What happens with some of these projects is there's a direct linkage to the revenue service date, so we had to stretch them out. So there's no increased cost. It's just that we needed the funds to go past the deadlines that were earlier prescribed.
And that's what requires council approval.
Correct. Any budget adjustments that we needed were done previously when we brought the Transit Commission budget adjustments to you, and there's no new net costs that are on top of that.
Okay. And my last question, and perhaps this is to the Deputy Treasurer, on document 5, the reserves continuity report, which we always appreciate. Is this in Is this consistent with budget documents that we approved last November? Is there any big change in these reserves?
It would be consistent. It would just be reflecting now the adjustments that we're making as part of this capital close.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Egli, please.
Thank you very much. My questions are related to the $900,000 for bus stops and shelters.
And what page that's on?
Oh, sorry. That's on, it's document number 1, capital projects recommended for closure, and it's on page 1, the very last entry. And it's more about, I see we spent $900,000. What does that buy? And the reason I raise this is because we're seeing right across the city an aging population. Demand for bus shelters in particular seems to be going up. So I'm just wondering how many shelters in a given year does $900,000 buy us?
Mr. Chair, it varies according to site condition and what degree of work needs to be done there. But I would say that buys between, I'm just going to do the math here, between 30 and 50 a year.
Okay, and with LRT coming on stream, which means that for a lot of our route, and going forward, a lot of our routes are not going to be traditional bus shelters or stops. They're going to be transit hubs and LRT stations. How is that going to impact on the dollars that we're spending on shelters?
So you have a couple of things at the major, at all the transfer stations. You will see, just go out to Tunney's and you're seeing shelters everywhere under the new design. We've upgraded a bunch also, and then you also gave us PTIF money. So wherever we have an opportunity to add shelters, we are. The struggle with the shelter costs, because I'm sure there's a bit of a sticker shock when Pat said those numbers, is you're retrofitting into existing environments. So if there's a swale, if there's a bike lane that needs to be adjusted, sidewalks, we on the PTIF funding, we saw some very, very high costs on some of the semi-rural shelters that we have to do, and that's because we have to move drainage systems and things like that. So wherever we can, we'll seize funding opportunities to add shelters. And then I can assure you on all the transfer stations and so forth with LRT, we've loaded them up very, very well with transfer shelters that are the new style.
Yeah, and frankly, I'm not that worried about at the main hubs, because I know we're going to be doing that. I'm more worried about people standing in the middle of Colonnade Road, for example, where there's nothing for miles, and open space, and it'd be very windy, very cold, that sort of thing. So where I'm really going with this is $900,000 a year enough for you to meet the demand of our aging population, or is that a bigger discussion that we need to have going into the next budget session?
It's a bigger discussion, but I would, before I would ask for more money, I would, one of the things that Pat and his team are doing a really good job of is looking at the style of shelter. Do we need full shelters? With our challenge is the winter. And so when you go to the southern climates, I often bring Pat pictures back of these semi-shelters, and he says that's fine if you're in Florida, but it's not going to work in Ottawa. They are doing some pretty innovative stuff at looking at bringing the cost of the shelters down. It's not enough if you want shelters at every stop. There is a warrant system that Pat puts the process through. And so we just need to be careful before we install a permanent shelter, and if things change and the warrants don't get met and so forth.
Okay, thank you for clarification.
So just before I go to Councillor Wilkinson, when do you recall the warrants were developed, and is that something that is worthwhile reviewing in the context of some of the questions that Councillor Egli was just asking?
Mr. Chair, the warrant system is really a ranking system.
Yeah.
Currently, it's not a pass or fail. It's a ranking system that looks at all the candidate locations, in other words, every location where there is not now a shelter, but there is a bus stop, and puts them in order, with the highest ones being the ones with the highest ridership, the highest number of seniors, the most exposure to the wind. Then there's a screening after that of where locations are physically able to be put. There's a lot of locations where the land is not available because you're in older parts of the city where the right-of-way is narrower or the right-of-way has been used for other purposes. At the moment, I would say that probably everyone, possibly a couple of exceptions, but where it's physically feasible to put in a shelter on the land available, and where there's more than 50, maybe even as low as 30 people a day using that stop has a shelter. So at the bottom end of the list is really the locations which are used by only a couple of dozen customers a day, or where it's not physically feasible. Most of the funding in recent years has been in installing shelters in growth areas where there's a lot of people. In a new area where the street design has funneled a lot of residential people to one bus stop, there's virtually no need for any more shelters other than if we go to very small ridership levels in any of the existing built-up parts of the city, except where land uses are changing, and that's when we look at them in particular.
Sure, I get, but land uses are changing in roughly half the city, right?
I'd say the land uses are changing in particular locations inside the Greenbelt, where most of the bus stops that need shelters have shelters, and more of the land use is changing as we convert from rural to urban in outer parts of the city.
Sure. Okay, well, I think it might be worthwhile to prepare your hit list of your priority listing, at least for the new term of council, because I expect that questions like Councillor Aguilar's will continue, and especially as we see whether it's intensification or changes in land use inside the city, or as we see urban development continue in our 4 or 5 suburban communities. I think it would be helpful for everyone to have an understanding of what's on the list and what's not on the list, and people can make decisions based, on their priorities from there.
Certainly, Chair. I mean, we'll add that to the list along with all the other stuff about new bus routes and capacities. Those are the trade-off discussions that Council will always have to have. So happy to add that to the list.
For sure. Thank you very much. Councillor Wilkinson.
Yeah, about on document 5 with the capital reserves again. I really want to know, we're going to be dealing on council next week with a request for EA to go to Barrhaven for light rail, which I think needs to get done. I have a problem with the funding of it, and the funding they've suggested is have to come from transit reserves and have to come from, and then the rest from transit DCs. Now, when we did the one to Canada, we didn't fund it that way at all. The half that came from the city came from our normal EA funding, and the half came from the federal government, which we should be able to get for this one as well. I'm just concerned about taking this money when we're so short for doing the light rail we're already doing, because that's being funded with these things. There's not enough money in these reserves to pay it anyway, just looking at them. What are the restrictions on using transit reserves? Because I don't remember us ever doing EAs before using the transit reserve, unless it was a capital project that included EA, like the first. I think we've done some of the transit ways that way, and certainly the DCs are listed in the DC bylaw, and I don't think this is in there, and it's been used for other things. So I think we need to have another source of funding and not this one. I just want to know how this works, if you've even been consulted on this, or the finance can say, is this the proper way to fund it?
Mr. Chair, I'll comment, then I'll ask the Deputy Treasurer if she would like to add. Those are all great questions. My suggestion is that you defer all that to the discussion at Council with the Treasurer. She's the one that assisted with the financing strategy on that. And we all know how thorough Ms. Simlick is in terms of that, and so I don't have those answers for you, and I look to the Deputy Treasurer whether she wants to comment, but my suggestion would be that you ask those questions at Council.
Well, I asked them at Council too, but I wanted to know, because it's an impact on the operation of this organization, of this committee, and I think that's what I'm concerned about.
I'm happy to. I will relay that to the Treasurer. I don't have those answers for you today, and Ms. Simlick
I'll be speaking with her before the meeting, but maybe we can get some preliminary.
The funding was just consistent with how we fund typical EAs, and it was a portion from DC and a portion from reserve. So that was consistent. We allot a certain amount each year for EAs, and so it may require future readjustments. But that, we just made it consistent with the funding.
But it was listed in the paper.
But, Councillor, the motion unfortunately is not at Transit Commission, it's at Council, and while I agree, it will,
But this here has a listing of how much is in there.
of our reserve, yes, but not on how we plan to spend it. And the motion that you're referring to is not at our committee, it's at Council. I think they're very appropriate questions at
The question on that one, Mr.
Council.
Chair, that affects this one, if the amount they need is greater than we have in the reserve, does that create a deficit in the reserve, or does that have to come from elsewhere?
And I think that's a pretty good question at Council when the motion is debated. The motion's not here in front of us.
What reserves are?
The reserves are, and I think that you've highlighted that very, very nicely. Any other questions? Seeing no other questions, the recommendation is that the Transit Commission recommends Council 1, authorize the closing of capital projects listed on Document 1, approve the budget adjustments as detailed in Document 2, permit those projects in Document 3 that qualify for closure to remain open, and 4, approve the return to source or funding draw for the following funding balances and eliminate debt authority resulting from closing of projects and budget adjustments for A, tax-supported reserves, $369,000, B, development charges, a deficit of $2.3 million, and C, debt authority, $6.5 million. Is that carried? Carried. Thank you very much. Item number 3 is the renewal of the Special Constable Program. Is there anything you'd like to say about this before we go to questions, Mr. Manconi?
We can go to questions,
Okay,
Mr. Chair.
Councillor Nussbaum.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to staff for the report. I just had a question or two relating to, it's actually in Document 1, which is the Ottawa Police Service Board report that went, I guess, to the board on 28th of May. Or it was written on the 28th of May. Anyway, on page 4 and 5 of that document, you've got just some useful charts that show a little bit the trend in terms of how the Special Constable Program has responded to various calls. And I just thought it was interesting that certainly I don't know if you can call it a trend, but in 2017 you saw a significant reduction in calls for service, which I think is a good thing, although I'm curious what you think in terms of whether there are other factors at play. But then the percentage of those calls that are related to criminal code or possible criminal code offenses went way up. So the ratio of those calls to the overall calls is something in the range of 250%, which is just interesting to note. And I'm wondering if staff have some sort of explanation for that, if we can understand better why we think that trend is happening.
Yes, Mr. Chair. I'll comment on the first piece, and then I'll ask Chief Babe to come up and he can explain the offense calls, criminal code offense calls. So the trend, it's not a trend. I think it's a good thing that in 2017 calls are down. Chief Babe and Mr. Charter have done a fantastic job of putting those officers out on the front line, so they're out of their vehicles and they're doing the walk and ride, bike and ride, and they're very, very active out in the system. And we believe that has had a very positive impact on how calls volume are being handled and so forth. With respect to the criminal code offenses, I'll ask Mr. Babe to speak to that.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. To answer your question, in 2017 we went live with as a member of the Ontario Police Technology Information Cooperative. So we have a records management system through Optic, which is made up of 48 police agencies in the province of Ontario. Part of how we catalog offences now under the records management system is to satisfy the uniform crime reporting requirements that's put out by the Government of Canada. What used to happen prior to 2017 was whenever we would attend a call for service, if there was more than one, I'll use the example of, say, a theft on the bus, and that theft led to an assault, we only categorized the most serious charge there, which was the assault. Now with the new records management system, we capture every criminal offense that occurred within that one call. So it's not that crimes have increased or criminal code offenses have increased. We've just captured a truer picture of it.
Thank you. That's helpful to understand. And then That chart is called Criminal Code of Canada Offence Calls, and then the chart on the subsequent page is Provincial and Bylaw Offence Charges. So the Criminal Code of Canada Offence Calls means that your officer are saying, we had an incident related to a potential criminal code charge, but the 2203 calls don't necessarily mean that those all translated into charges. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So do you have a number, or do you keep in your record management system a number for how many of those calls would have translated into charges?
We do. I can get you a number based on the number of charges. For some of them that we categorize, we turn over to the Ottawa Police Service, so we wouldn't have a follow-up there as to whether Ottawa Police pursued charges or not. We just categorize it on, we arrive, the facts signify that it would be a criminal code offense. If a suspect is on location, we tend to make the arrest and the charge is laid, but we certainly can provide, Mr. Chair, we can provide a number of arrests and charges as well.
Thank you. And I guess my last question is there a distinction between the jurisdiction of the special constables to issue charges under the criminal code versus issue charges under the provincial and bylaw offense? So are those treated differently? So do you essentially triage the criminal code offenses to the OPS, and the special constables can deal themselves with the bylaw and provincial offenses? Or how does that work?
Mr. Chair, the lower level criminal code offenses, the special constables can lead the charges themselves. So for that's things like minor assaults, minor thefts, mischiefs under $5,000, all the minor crimes. Any of the major crimes go to Ottawa Police. We may be first on scene and we gather the information, but it's the absolute jurisdiction of the Ottawa Police Service. When it comes to provincial offenses and bylaw offenses, that's special constables would lay those charges, and those are charges like intoxicated in public, open alcohol, trespass to property, panhandling at a bus shelter under the Safe Streets Act, and then the myriad of bylaw offenses that may occur throughout the system.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Crew.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just following up on the kind of what the numbers mean with the chart on page 6 showing the provincial and bylaw offense charges, do the numbers there include bylaw charges in relation to fare enforcement?
Yes, they do. It's all captured as a single picture for this report.
And do you have an idea what proportion of the charges that are shown there, particularly for the recent year, would in fact be fare enforcement charges as opposed to other bylaws or other provincial offenses?
Mr. Chair, I don't have that information with me, and we can certainly provide it.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any other questions? Seeing none. The recommendation is that the Transit Commission receive this report for information. Is it received? Received. Thank you very much. There are no in-camera items. Are there any notices of motion for subsequent meetings? Any other inquiries? Other business? We have adjournment. Our next meeting is on the 19th of September. Have a wonderful and safe, relaxing summer.